So now we move on to our next king, which will be Numa. But what happens when a king dies? We've covered it. What happens when a king dies?
You get someone from the Senate to act as
A senator now acts as interrex while the Senate has to decide upon this new guy. Now, what does the Senate look like at this time? There's 200 of them, 100 Latins, and 100 Sabines. And it just so happens the Latins want a Latin king and won't accept any Sabine king. And the Sabines want the Sabine king and won't accept any Latin king.
I'm surprised he let the Sabines stay after they lost their king.
Yep, the Sabines completely integrated with Rome. It's one of the things that Rome does very well, is grows and integrates populations as they conquer. Some integrate more than less, but early on, a lot of integrating your populations. And so, there's this extended interregnum being the period of time that there's no official government operating, and it almost lasts about a year where they just keep having these interrexes for 5 days. And this is causing huge problems in the city. Understand, what is the king's job? Everything. Imagine you've got a court case, right? And one week, it's this guy who's a really nice guy, and he hardly finds you at all. And the next week, it's this jerk who's out to get every dime from you he can. It's a lot of fluctuation in who is ruling, back and forth, back and forth. Imagine the United States had a new president every 5 days.
None of them know what they're doing.
Well, whether they do or they don't, but it's chaotic. And they were particularly worried about what would happen if someone attacked us right now. You've got to be out in the field for a month or whatever it is, and we're going to sit here and swap out generals every 5 days? This is a problem. So neither side of the Senate wants to give, but they recognize that this is a very dangerous situation that they're in right now, and they've got to select a king. And the people are getting furious at him, hating having all these different kings. They say, we used to have one tyrant, and now we traded in one tyrant for 100 or something like that. And so the Senate finally strikes up a deal. Here's what they agree to. They agree that we will allow the Romans by themselves to pick the king. Or the Latins, I mean. They're all Romans. We'll let the Latins pick the king. However, the king has to be a Sabine. So one side gets to pick, and it has to come from the other side. The Sabines were very picky about it being a Sabine because they felt kind of cheated. There were supposed to be 2 kings, and their guy got killed, and they didn't get to replace him. So they feel like they're owed a Sabine king. And so, after much discussion, they finally decide to elect a guy by the name of Numa. He didn't even live in the city of Rome. So, it does not have to be someone from the Senate who gets selected as king, or apparently even a Roman. Or if he was a Roman, he definitely didn't live in the city. But he was someone who had a great reputation for being a very wise and pious man. Now, initially, he rejected their offer, said, nope, don't want it. But with a bunch of bling, they finally got Numa to agree to this job of being the king of Rome. And so that's how Numa comes to be the king. Viewed as a very wise and pious man, there were rumors that he was potentially the student of Pythagoras. Now, this makes no sense with our dates, because Pythagoras' dates are 570 to 490 BC. Numa's dates are supposedly the dates at least that he ruled, are right there. And so you see, we got 100 years off here. Something doesn't add up. Should probably have said before, when we were talking about, you remember when Aeneas went to Carthage and visited Dido?
Yeah.
They're also off by about 200 to 300 years in terms of timeline. So, some of these problems with these early stories, the dates just don't add up. Now, not very likely that he was a student of Pythagoras, if he lived during these years. And if he was a student of Pythagoras, then the years that he ruled must be way off.
Or maybe he was like a student of a student.
Well, Pythagoras comes after. It's hard to learn from a guy who hasn't been born yet.
I
You can learn from dead guys, that's easy.
I get switched around with the BC getting.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yep, smaller is bigger. A later year is a smaller number. We're going down. BC to the year 0. Okay, good. So, as his reputation, that's largely why he's selected. And he focuses almost exclusively on setting up Rome's religion. He is a pious, disciplined man, and he's determined to make Rome the same way. And so he sets up a bunch of their early religious institutions, practices, a bunch of festivals, a bunch of holidays. He reigns over a period of peacetime, apparently no wars over his whole rule. And there's kind of two things credited with that. One is that Romulus just kind of wrecked the surrounding population, and so they have been dealt with that way. But the other piece of it is Numa did a lot to soften surrounding tribes' view of the Romans. And the way Levy says it is, before Rome was viewed as a camp amongst cities. With Numa, it's now viewed as a city amongst cities. And so he does a lot to civilize the population, so to speak, is the way it's portrayed. And so people aren't as threatened by Rome when Numa is sitting on the throne. So, big picture of him, rules for 42 years. Any questions before we get into some of his more particular things? Okay, so one of his bigger achievements is he established a lunar calendar for Rome. Now, Rome's calendar prior to Numa had 304 days on it. And then, after 304 days, they had what they called winter. Winter was not some set number of days. Winter is how much time it goes until spring. And once spring hits, then you start your months again. So Numa set it up on a lunar calendar. You understand what a lunar calendar is? Where the moon cycles dictate the month. Actually, I have a good image for this. Should be using this. So what was it before? Before Numa, here were your months. Here's roughly how many days were in there. These are approximations because we're not positive. These two things were not months. So your first month was Martius, named after Mars. You had your first month, your second month, April, your third month, May, your fourth month, June, your fifth month, Quintilis, before it was named July, your sixth month, Sextilis, before it was renamed August, your seventh month, September, your eighth month, October, your ninth month, November. I say non because non is 9, but they got rid of the N in between. And then your 10th month, December. If you know some of those prefixes, you know that those are numbers. Quin, 5, sex, 6, sept, 7, oct, 8, non, 9, dec, 10. And so that's why those months have their names. And that's where it comes from. So Numa sets them up on a lunar calendar. On a lunar calendar, you're trying to get each month to line up with the cycles of the moon. A moon goes through all its phases in 29 and a half days. And so you're basically trying to get your months to line up with the cycles of the moon. That's the attempt.
Is it exactly half?
Close enough. But so that means that it's very hard to set how many days should you have in a month if a lunar cycle is 29 and a half days. And so that's why the days kind of jump around the way that they do. So he sets up 12 months. In order to go through 12 lunar cycles, it's roughly 355 days. The problem that you have is it's 365 days, roughly, for the Earth to go around the moon. Around the sun. Copernicus was way off. I'm telling you guys. It's the moon. Okay. And so what they did is they introduced, every so often, a 13th month to realign the lunar calendar with the solar calendar. We think of calendars as being these fixed things that you don't mess with. Prior to Julius Caesar, it is some religious personnel's responsibility to fix the calendar and to decide how the calendar is going to be that year.
You mean that it was off an entire month before they fixed it?
It is up to some religious official to decide when to insert the month and how long to make the month, to try and realign things.
But that would just mean that they would be off a month and then they just all of a sudden insert a month to fix everything.
Right, so you'd have a shorter year, shorter year, shorter year, shorter year, longer year.
Really long.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a leap year. I mean, we go around adding days.
Yeah, that's, yeah, that's 30 times more accurate.
That's sick. Actually, we should do that.
And now, on the lunar calendar, they also had special names for some of their days. The day of Calends is the first day of the month. And this is Numa establishing this, and you got to make your proper sacrifice each month on this day, the first day of the month. And then you have the day of Nones, which is roughly 1/4 into the month when your moon's on the half cycle. And then you have the Ides of whatever that month is, if your date is on, if you're right in the middle, so that's going to be roughly at the 15th of each month. And then it cycles through again, and you have those days again. Now, these festivals, these sacrifices, these religious practice, and politics are completely ingrained into the Roman way about thinking about days. If I were a Roman and you asked me when I was born, I would not say November 10th, 1992. I would say I was born in the 4th year of George Bush Sr., 5 days prior to the Ides of November. And everyone would instantly know what I was talking about. They did not talk about it in terms of this day of this month of this year. They had that, and largely it was your scholars who would talk about dates that way. But the way that you would reference your date was based off of how close it was, or far it was from the closest festival, and who was the ruler at that year. And everyone would just instantly know what you were talking about. That's how ingrained these festivals are, and how ingrained politics is to just our daily life. So, festivals, a big deal. Numa largely set a bunch of these religious practices up. It seems like Romulus only really did it with the cult of Hercules, and then outside of that, Numa does pretty much everything else initially. Okay, any questions about calendars or time so far? So that's one of the things he did. Right, add days manually to realign with the calendar we already talked about that. Okay, festivals, added festivals all over the place. And he split the days into profane days and sacred days. You weren't allowed to work on sacred days. You could only work on the profane days. Similar to the way we typically view a Sabbath. One of the rationales for why he added so many festivals to the Roman calendar is he was worried that his men would become restless after being such great warriors with not going out and fighting. And so, supposedly, part of his rationale for establishing all these festivals and all these holidays is just to keep the Romans distracted. Now, establishes a ton of religious orders. One we already talked about that Numa introduces at Rome is the Vestal Virgins. Remember that those were the ones who had to keep the sacred fire going all the time, always had a fire going. And so Vestal Virgins, they'll now be a big deal in Rome from there on out. And there's tons of different orders that they have with their different priests and whatever. That's just an example of one.
Did they keep the fire up?
Well, that's just one of their responsibilities. I don't know all their responsibilities. I didn't bother getting into the details of the Roman religion because, my wow. Okay, the other thing he did is he was worried that future kings would not be as observant of religious practices as they ought to be. And that there ought to be someone whose sole focus is religious practices. And so he establishes the position of the Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex Maximus. Now, technically, the king has the powers of what we call the Rex Seclorum, and we'll have more to say about that position coming down the road. So, the king still has a high religious position, the king position, but he appoints this other position, the Pontifex Maximus, and they are basically the state's head of the religion. And it's their job to make sure that all the festivals are being taken care of, independent of the king. And they would preside over things like even funeral services, making sure that those were handled the way that they needed to be handled. So this was like the man's access to a religious man, because the king, he's got everything else already. Now technically he still has this religious power, so it's not like he gave up the religious power and now the Pontifex Maximus has it. But he's just, it's his full-time job to take care of the more day-to-day things of the religion.
So the Vatican is like 2 miles away from the Seven Hills. Is the Pope kind of this person?
This title of Pontifex Maximus persists to this day. The Pope is the Pontifex Maximus of the Catholic Church.
That's cool.
That's his title. And so, yeah, that title doesn't go away. And we can see the title today.
So that lasted through the Senate and through the Empire.
Yeah, it just so happened to be the case that Julius Caesar held this position when he became the first emperor. And then Octavian pretty much just took it because no one else had it after the death of Julius Caesar, and it just presided with the emperor for an extended period after that. And that could largely just be an accident of the fact that Julius Caesar happened to hold this role in government when he was assassinated.
Another interesting, well, I don't mean to distract too much, but there was the gladiator ring right next to the Seven Hills as well. And I was wondering, will you let us know when that pops up?
Probably. I have no clue what's coming down the road.
Alright.
Okay. So Pontifex Maximus, responsible for the religious practices, he's the one also responsible for maintaining the calendar. The name of their 13th month was Mercedonius, and so it was his job to figure out where do we stick it and how long should it be. Came under Pontifex Maximus, which is why Julius Caesar is the one who did the calendar. It's because he was a Pontifex Maximus. And that is his job to take care of the Roman calendar. And then they also had a bunch of clerical work, maintaining religious and legal records of things that happened. And the other thing to always keep in mind is religion and government are very intertwined. Going all the way forward in Rome, they do not have government buildings. They have temples. And they meet in temples. And they do government business in temples. And so, very intertwined, and it's a very normal thing that your priests are also keeping your legal records. Nothing strange about that. And then he also constructed all sorts of temples and shrines, most famous amongst them being the Temple of Janus. The Temple of Janus, the rules were for its doors that they would be open in times of war and closed in times of peace. Those were the rules.
Okay.
So the doors were closed all through Numa's rule. They were opened right after, and they were not closed again, for those of you who know some of your history, until after the Punic Wars. And they were closed for a short period, and then reopened again, and were not closed again until Octavian pretty much takes the Principate.
That's crazy. That's forever.
So it's basically safe haven.
Well, it's not a safe haven, it's just a symbol that Rome is at war. When the doors are open, that means Rome's at war. When the doors are closed, that means Rome's at peace with its surroundings.
Who's Janus? Is he like
Janus?
Janus?
Some god. Don't know the Greek pantheon very well, or the Roman pantheon very well. So, a bunch of these things I won't be able to answer off the top of my head. But the point is, Rome was pretty much at war after Numa from there on out. And the doors were always open. They were always considered themselves at war with their enemies. You, as a Roman boy growing up in the streets, you look at that temple, you know what it means for those doors to be open, and you understand Rome is at war. Okay. Any questions about any of that?
Yeah, do you think it was Numa that kind of incorporated the Greek pantheon and religion into its own Roman flavor?
So historically speaking, what likely happened is that there were a series of religious rulers that adopted a bunch of practices, or that Rome adopted a bunch of religious practices over time, and they just consolidated them all together and said, this guy did it. And yes, Greece, being one of their major neighbors, had a huge influence on the religions that developed there, and the Etruscans being the other ones. And so a bunch of their religion and a bunch of their traditions are largely informed by the Etruscans and the Greeks. Those are the two big boys on the block, so to speak, that Rome's surrounded by.
But considering the ruler was a Sabine, then whatever religion the Sabines had likely is what got adopted.
But who knows?
Okay.
Because, yeah, the religion that the Romans end up with largely follows the Greeks. The Greeks definitely have the largest influence on the Roman pantheon.
What do you mean Roman pantheon?
The gods that they recognized as canon.
Is pantheon like a term for a religious body of knowledge or beliefs?
Collection of the gods,
It's like Greek
the
mythology.
deities. What's a general word? The mythical things that you accept as real.
Would you say so, like a religion, like
Right. It's very much a religion.
in just a distinct
Well, a pantheon is going to be a collection of them.
of religions?
It's like
Religious
all
beings.
of your gods.
Yeah,
It's
but
like-
also accepting things that we call gods that they would. The Titans, I think, would technically be part of the Greek pantheon.
Oh,
Yeah, it's like, yeah. It's not necessarily like a set of beliefs. It's like
The monotheism is very strange. No one has that. Everyone's got their pantheons of gods that they accept. Because how do these things evolve? This little city's developing over here, and they worship the things that they worship, and this little city's over here worshiping the things that they worship. Eventually they come together and say, we now worship all these things. And it goes on its merry way.
That's interesting.
And so the Romans were happy to adopt. They conquer some peoples, they hear about your gods. Oh, I didn't know about him. Maybe if I make a sacrifice to him, he'll help my field. I don't know. Worth a try.
It's true. It is worth trying.
They come with some good festivals. How do you celebrate?
Also, it likely caused less friction to adopt their beliefs rather than try to.
Right. Romans just integrate what's around them. They are not innovators. They are adopters.
It's badass.
They adapt to whatever the situation, and they adopt whatever they need to conquer the situation. Very pragmatic type people. Okay. Any other questions with this? Did I cover all those? Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
And we talked about the calendar. Okay.